They think we're already dead. Commander Ryland Voss spat the words like steel against stone, his grip tightening on the rail, as the UES Iron Soul dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a violent jolt. The ship shuddered, its aging hull groaning under the strain. Strips of exposed wiring flickered along the control panels, like veins pumping the last dregs of life into a corpse. From the bridge's laser plasma display, the battlefield spread before them, a silent graveyard of broken ships, their charred husks drifting through the black like discarded bones in a hunter's den. "They sure as hell don't expect us to fight," Lieutenant Aaron Kane muttered, his fingers running over the navigation console, recalibrating stabilizers with brutal efficiency. "We're the fleet's scrapyard reject. What do they think we're going to do? Throw debris at them?" The bridge was filled with the controlled chaos of a crew that had learned to function under duress. Low chatter between comms officers, the tap of boots against steel plating, the occasional spark from an overheated relay. It smelled of hot metal, sweat, and machine oil, the perfume of desperation on an underfunded warship. Voss narrowed his eyes at the carnage outside. A Zalari task force had been stationed here just 3 hours ago. Now, not even wreckage big enough to house a cockpit remained. "They didn't fight," Dr. Leora Vex said from her station, the analytical gleam in her eyes shadowed by something deeper, unease. "Whatever took them out, it wasn't a battle. No impact craters, no residual heat from weapons fire. It's like they were—" She hesitated, swallowing the words, then finished with chilling finality. "Erased." Voss felt something deep in his gut, a sensation he hadn't acknowledged in years. Doubt. The Iron Soul wasn't here for battle. They had been sent as an afterthought, a low-tier scouting vessel, a retirement post for a commander the Alliance no longer wanted in real engagements. His career had ended the moment he questioned the way the war was being fought. Now he was nothing more than a gravekeeper, sent to catalog the dead. Whatever happened to them, it wasn't an accident, Voss muttered. Comms. Anything on wideband frequencies? Ensign Harlan, the youngest officer on board, turned from his console. His face had the color of recycled water rations. "Nothing, sir. It's like the entire sector was—" The ship's AI, Nova, flickered to life, her synthetic voice cool and measured. "Commander, long-range scanners have detected an unknown vessel on the outer rim of the debris field." Silence tightened its grip around the bridge. Every head turned toward the main heads-up display. A ship. Not wreckage, not floating debris. Something moving. Something watching. "Identify," Voss ordered. The screen sharpened, outlining the vessel in a harsh red glow, an elongated, seamless construct, matte black against the void, absorbing rather than reflecting light. No thruster exhaust, no signal emissions. It shouldn't exist. And yet there it was, waiting. Kane exhaled sharply. "No registry, no known schematics. It's not one of ours," Vex said quietly. "And it's not Zalari either." A pause, then, "Sir," Harlan's voice cracked, a whisper of disbelief. "It's ignoring us." Voss frowned. "Come again, Ensign." Harlan swallowed. "It's scanning everything. The wreckage, residual energy signatures, but not us. It doesn't even register the Iron Soul as a ship." It was like standing in front of a predator that had yet to decide if it was hungry. Voss's jaw tensed. Every instinct he had screamed leave now, but that wasn't an option, not without answers. "Power down non-essential systems," he ordered. "Minimal energy output. If it's ignoring us, let's keep it that way." Tarn Ulan, the Iron Soul's cybernetic engineer, adjusted the ship's interface with a series of quick, calculated keystrokes. "Dropping our EM signature to near zero. We'll be as noticeable as a lifeless rock." The bridge settled into an eerie quiet, like the moment before a sniper's trigger pull. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, the unknown ship tilted, not moved, not repositioned, just tilted, its structure shifting in an unnatural way, as if studying something unseen. And then it was gone. No thrusters, no acceleration. It simply vanished. The space it had occupied now as empty as the graveyard it had left behind. A heavy exhale left Vex's lips. What the hell was that? Voss didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the sensor readout, and his stomach dropped like a dead weight. The wreckage field had changed. Where once there had been the charred remnants of a Zalari fleet, now only static flickered across their screens, as if the entire battle site had been wiped from reality itself. No hull fragments, no residual particles, just cold, unbroken space, and the Iron Soul still wasn't being detected. Voss's grip on the rail tightened. He had been in wars, fought brutal battles, faced enemies that slaughtered without mercy. But this was something else. "We're leaving," he said finally. "Now." Kane wasted no time, fingers flying over the navigation controls. The Iron Soul pivoted, engaging its jump drive. As they prepared for departure, Vex whispered the words no one wanted to say aloud. "If that thing isn't attacking because it doesn't see us as a threat, what happens when it does?" A cold certainty settled over Voss's mind. If the Iron Soul was the only ship left untouched, then it wasn't just luck. It was a mistake. And when their enemy finally realized it, that mistake would be corrected. The Iron Soul tore through the void, its sublight thrusters rattling against the ship's battered frame. The command deck was steeped in silence, not the careful quiet of discipline, but the kind that sat on men's shoulders like a coiled predator waiting to strike. The only sound was the static crackle of the ship's cooling systems, struggling to keep up with the overworked reactor cores. Rylan Voss stood rigid at the bridge, his fingers gripping the rail so tightly that the metal dug into his palms. He should have felt relief. They had escaped that thing, but relief never came when you left behind something you didn't understand. "Report," he ordered, his voice cut from stone. Kane's hands moved over the navigation console, shadows pooling under his eyes. "Plotting us a return course to Fleet Command," he muttered, "assuming they'll actually listen to us." "They won't." The words left Voss's lips before he even had time to consider them. Silence answered. Harlan hesitated at the comm station, the dim light from his display casting his face in sharp relief. "You think they'll just ignore us?" "I think," Voss said, turning toward the crew, "that the Zalari have spent too many decades believing their technology makes them invincible. They don't know what to do when something stronger appears." Stronger. The word felt like a fracture in logic. The Zalari were the most technologically advanced civilization in the known systems. Humanity had spent years scrambling to catch up, modifying their weapons, integrating artificial intelligence into their fleet, trying to match the Alliance's standards. And yet, they had just watched a fleet disappear into nothing, their remains erased as if they had never been there at all. "Sir," Leora Vex's voice cut through the air like a scalpel through tissue, dragging Voss from his thoughts. She turned from her station, her dark eyes reflecting the cold glow of her heads-up display. "There's something wrong with our long-range sensors." Kane exhaled sharply. "Define wrong." "They're picking up interference, but there's no known source. It's not electromagnetic disruption, it's not radiation decay, and it's not natural space distortion. It's just—" She paused, her jaw tightening as she worked through the data. "It's like the sensors are looking at something that isn't there." The deck seemed to shrink, the air thinning as everyone processed the implications. Voss pushed off the railing and stepped behind her, scanning the readings. At first glance it was just static, a storm of unreadable data. But then he saw it, the absence, no drift particles, no background cosmic radiation, no heat signatures from where the destroyed Zalari fleet had been. Just a hollow void in the data, as if space itself had been rewritten. "This isn't a sensor malfunction," Voss muttered. "It's something worse." Vex gave a slow nod. "Something is altering reality on a scale we don't understand." A muscle ticked in Kane's jaw. "Great. We're fighting an enemy that can rewrite physics. Fantastic." "We're not fighting them," Voss said, voice quiet. "We're running." Harlan stiffened. "Sir, if the Zalari fleet—" "The Zalari are gone." The words tasted like rust in Voss's mouth, but he didn't hesitate to say them. "And if we don't move now, we'll be next." Tarn Ulan, the Iron Soul's chief engineer, had been silent up until now, his large frame rigid as he watched from the corner of the deck. When he spoke, it was slow, measured, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. "This ship," he murmured, "is the only thing that thing didn't touch." No one wanted to acknowledge it, but they had all thought it. Why? Voss turned to the sensor readout again, his mind working faster than his body could keep up. The Zalari ships had been built on quantum-based technology. Their defenses were designed to integrate self-repairing nanostructures, automated targeting systems, and predictive combat analytics, the most advanced systems known to the galaxy. The Iron Soul? Old, rusted, dependent on manual inputs, a relic of a less refined, more brutal age. Kane exhaled through his teeth. "Tell me we're not about to say what I think we're about to say." Vex didn't look up. "The Iron Soul isn't running on modern tech. Our AI is a support system, not an automated war brain. Our targeting is manual. Our thrusters are outdated. Our shielding is—" She trailed off, then gave a sharp laugh. "Oh, this is poetic. We've been called primitive for decades. Turns out that might be the only thing keeping us alive." Voss's stomach twisted. If this was true, if the Xiphos only attacked modernized technology, then the Zalari were already doomed. Their entire fleet, their entire society, was built on quantum networking. "They don't see us as a threat," Voss murmured. Tarn nodded slowly. "Not yet." Silence hung over the bridge, suffocating in its intensity. Then, "Sir." Harlan's voice was barely above a whisper. Voss turned. The young officer's hands gripped his console so hard his knuckles had gone white. "We're picking up movement." Heads snapped toward the laser plasma display. A single red marker had appeared at the edge of their scanning range. No heat trail, no emissions, just a shifting black silhouette against the stars. It was coming back. Voss straightened. "Battle stations!" The bridge crew reacted immediately, but there was no panic. Just controlled, sharp movements, the kind that came with years of knowing your own death could arrive at any moment. Vex flicked through her system, trying to gather data before they lost the opportunity. "Still no ID," she muttered. "It's not accelerating toward us, but it's moving." "Toward what?" Kane demanded. A long pause. Then, "It's heading for the nearest Zalari fleet." A ripple of cold understanding passed through the bridge. It hadn't even considered the Iron Soul worth killing. Kane exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against his forehead. "I hate being right." Voss turned back to the display, watching the unknown entity drift through the abyss with the calmness of something that had never known the concept of fear. The Zalari wouldn't see it coming. They would never see it coming. And by the time they realized what was happening, they'd already be gone. "They're dead," Harlan whispered. "Every single one of them." Voss didn't answer. His gaze was locked onto the laser plasma display where the Zalari fleet had just ceased to exist. One moment, their ships had been intact, gliding through the black with the arrogance of an empire that had never known an enemy stronger than itself. The next, they were nothing, no debris, no escape pods, just absence, like someone had reached into the void and wiped them from history. "Commander?" Kane's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something raw. They had all seen destruction before. They had watched planets burn, seen fleets crushed beneath superior firepower. But this was an undoing. Voss inhaled slowly, tasting the stale oxygen filtering through the ship's vents. He turned away from the display and faced his crew. "We move," he said. "Now." Tarn Ulan shifted in his seat, his cybernetic fingers tapping against the edge of his console. "And go where exactly? The Alliance won't believe us. The Zalari can't believe anything anymore, considering they've just been erased from existence." "The Xiphos are following a pattern," Vex murmured, running calculations faster than the ship's aged processors could manage. She tapped a finger against the heads-up display, bringing up the trajectory of every vanished fleet over the past month. "Every attack has taken place in high-traffic war sectors. If we follow this path backward, there's a common point, a dead system at the outer edges of known space." Kane frowned. "A dead system?" Vex nodded, her voice measured. "It's marked as uninhabitable. No colonization attempts, no resource extraction. But something was there once. There are ruins. A tension built in the air, something unspoken passing between them all. Tarn exhaled sharply. You're saying the Xiphos aren't attacking at random. They're cleaning up. Voss pushed off the railing, stepping closer to the heads-up display. Set a course. We'll find out what was worth burying. Harlan hesitated. Sir, if the Zalari couldn't fight back, what makes you think we can? Voss didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the Iron Soul's dimly lit bulkheads, the exposed piping lining the walls like sinew stretched across a carcass. The ship had been deemed useless, left to rot on the fringes of war. But it had survived, and survivors learned faster than the dead. He looked back at his crew. Because we adapt, he said, and the dead don't. The Iron Soul tore through subspace, its engines burning hotter than their cooling systems were designed to handle. Kane muttered a string of curses as he adjusted the thruster output manually, fighting the ship's sluggish response time. This heap wasn't built for long-distance jumps, he grumbled. We keep running at these speeds, and we'll burn out half the drive cores before we even get there. We don't have time to go slow, Voss replied. Right, because rushing toward a graveyard is a fantastic plan. Tarn leaned back, watching the exchange with a neutral expression. We could eject the secondary fuel lines, he offered. Cut the weight. Might give us a little more power without overloading the system. Vex glanced up from her workstation. And if we need that fuel later? Tarn shrugged. Then we're dead later instead of dead now. Voss rolled his shoulders, the stiffness settling deep into his bones. Do it! The Iron Soul shuddered as the emergency fuel lines were severed, and the thrusters surged forward with renewed force. Time was their enemy now, and time was running out. The dead system appeared ahead of them, an eclipsed world drifting in the gravity well of a dying star. The planet's surface was fractured, deep scars running across its continents like the bones of something that had been broken and never healed. The Iron Soul's scanners flickered, struggling to process what lay beneath the dust storms swirling over the ruins. This place was inhabited once, Vex murmured. Tarn studied the readouts. Not just inhabited, advanced. He gestured to a subterranean structure partially exposed beneath layers of collapsed terrain. That's artificial, and it's been buried deliberately. Harlan swallowed. Buried by what? A cold certainty settled into Voss's stomach. Not what. He looked back toward the display where the ruins' jagged architecture cast long, distorted shadows against the planet's cracked surface. Who? A single structure remained fully intact. A tower, impossibly ancient, standing alone in the dust. Kane's brows furrowed. Looks like a comms relay. Voss stared at the tower. Something about its design unsettlingly familiar. The patterns engraved into the metal weren't Zalari. They weren't human, but they were not alien either. Vex's hands hovered over her console. Commander, there's something buried deeper, something shielded. She tapped the side of her heads-up display, adjusting the sensor output. It's emitting a low-level energy signature, but it's not active. If I had to guess, I'd say it's been dormant for centuries. Tarn exhaled. Then why is it still powered? A cold silence settled. Voss straightened. Gear up. We're going down. The air inside the ruins was stale, thick with the weight of centuries-old dust that clung to every surface like an unbroken layer of time itself. The walls stretched high above them, engraved with symbols that seemed to shift when caught in the glow of their rifle-mounted lights. Tarn knelt beside a fallen slab of stone, his cybernetic fingers brushing over a metallic fragment embedded in the rubble. This isn't just old, he muttered. This is a relic from a civilization that knew something we didn't. Vex stood beside the central console, its surface smooth despite the decay surrounding it. She ran a hand across the interface, watching as faint lights flickered beneath her touch. It's a control station, she murmured, for something big. Kane kept his rifle raised, his gaze flicking toward the deeper halls ahead. Yeah? Well, let's not wake it up. Voss approached the control panel, his eyes narrowing at the single line of text that pulsed against the console's surface. The language was ancient, untranslatable. But he didn't need to read it to understand. He could feel what it meant. A warning, a grave marker for something that should have stayed buried. Vex's fingers hovered over the controls. "Commander," she hesitated. Then, a low vibration ran through the ruins, shaking dust from the walls. Harlan's voice cracked over the comms. "Sir, I think something just came online." Voss turned sharply, scanning the dark corridors that stretched beyond their reach. Somewhere in the shadows, metal shifted against metal. A sound that hadn't been heard in thousands of years. Then the first red sensor light flickered to life, and another, and another. Vex's voice was tight. "We're not alone." Voss's grip tightened on his weapon. "Move, now." Because whatever had been buried here hadn't died, and now it was waking up. The walls breathed dust. It poured from the cracks, swirling in the dim red glow of newly awakened sensors. The air inside the ruins felt wrong, thick like something alive was watching from the dark, something that had been waiting. "Commander?" Vex's voice was hushed but urgent, her hand still hovering over the ancient control panel. The text pulsed beneath her fingertips, a rhythmic, slow throb, like a warning heartbeat carved into dead stone. Voss barely flicked his gaze toward her. His attention was locked on to the shifting metal deeper in the ruins, a sound that had no echo, like something moving in silence, something unbound by the rules of physics as they understood them. "Now," he said, the word barely above a growl. "We're leaving. Now." Kane didn't wait for orders. He was already moving, his rifle raised, scanning the darkened corridors ahead. Tarn shoved a data core into his pack, his mechanical fingers tightening over the strap as he rose. Then, the first red light moved. Not a flicker, not a malfunction, a deliberate shift, as if something was turning to face them. Voss didn't hesitate. "Go!" They sprinted. The floor beneath them rumbled, the vibrations crawling up their legs, as if the structure itself was reacting to their presence. Somewhere deep within the ruins, a low, inhuman sound reverberated, not organic, not mechanical, but something in between, as if the air itself was being rewritten. Kane cursed under his breath, pushing ahead as they cleared the corridor and burst back into the open wasteland. The sky overhead was bruised with dark clouds, the dying star casting jagged shadows across the fractured terrain. Then the ruins moved. Not collapsed, not shook. Moved. Like a body waking up. Voss turned just in time to see the central tower split open, the seams running deep like ancient wounds splitting at last. From within, something clawed its way into the light, a structure skeletal yet seamless, unfolding with deliberate purpose. It wasn't built. It had grown. And it wasn't dead. On the ship. Now. They didn't need to be told twice. The Iron Soul was already prepping for an emergency launch, its exterior floodlights cutting through the ashen haze, illuminating the rising construct with harsh clarity. And still, the thing unfolded. Metal shifted with a fluidity that defied engineering, sections reshaping, bending, locking into new configurations as though it were evolving in real time. "What the hell is it doing?" Harlan's voice cracked over comms as the Iron Soul's ramp lowered. Tarn leapt aboard, dragging Vex up after him. Kane was next, rifle still trained on the structure, his breath sharp. Voss was last. As he stepped onto the ship, the ruin gave its final, shuddering transformation. And then it stopped. The red sensors blinked out. The structure, no longer shifting, no longer twisting, was looking at them. A moment passed. A heartbeat stretched too thin. Then the signal hit. Nova, the Iron Soul's AI, flickered to life across the bridge's laser plasma displays, her voice laced with something the AI wasn't programmed to feel. Unidentified transmission detected. Voss barely slid into his chair before a burst of alien data flooded the system. It wasn't a message, it wasn't communication, it was an alert, and it wasn't directed at them. The Iron Soul had triggered something bigger. "They know we're here," Vex whispered, the horror creeping into her voice. "Who?" Kane demanded. "Who knows?" Voss didn't answer. Because he already knew. The Xiphos. And they were coming. The first wave of Xiphos warships entered the system exactly 4 hours later. The Iron Soul remained hidden beneath the planet's decaying magnetic field, its systems running on near-zero emissions. The crew worked in silence, the weight of what they had just uncovered pressing against them like a hand around their throats. "They aren't attacking," Harlan muttered, his eyes fixed on the heads-up display. "They don't need to." Voss's voice was cold. "They're searching." And that was worse, because the Xiphos didn't need to search for anything. They knew. Vex exhaled through her teeth, her hands moving over the main console, decrypting the remnants of the ruin's ancient transmission. "I think I know what we just tripped," she said. "That structure wasn't a ruin. It was a warning beacon." Tarn stiffened. "A warning for what?" Vex's face was pale in the glow of the display. "Not for us. For them." A long silence. Kane leaned forward. "You're saying the Xiphos weren't the first ones here?" Vex swallowed. "I'm saying they might not even be the biggest thing we should be afraid of." The words settled over them like a blade pressing against a throat. But there was no time for speculation, because at that moment the Xiphos found them. The first attack wasn't an assault. It was a calculation. A Xiphos harvester drone descended toward the ruins, scanning, analyzing, processing the shift in the structure's configuration. The Iron Soul remained still. Tarn's hands hovered over the energy suppression controls, his pulse hammering. "If they register us, we're finished." Voss stayed silent, watching the scanner. The drone paused, its sleek frame humming as it processed the terrain. Then it turned away. The bridge exhaled. But then Vex's display flared red. "No, no, no!" Kane jerked toward her. "What?" Vex's fingers flew over the console. "They just adjusted their scans. They're looking for an energy signature that doesn't match their own. And guess what the only non-quantum-based ship in the system is?" Silence. Then the drone snapped back toward them. Voss's eyes narrowed. "Burn it!" Tarn didn't hesitate. He flipped the override. The Iron Soul's railguns discharged in unison, a streak of white-hot slugs piercing the drone before it could react. It didn't explode. It collapsed, folding into itself like a dying star, like something consuming its own existence rather than be taken. A single pulse of energy rippled outward from the implosion. Then, Nova's voice was quiet. "Enemy reinforcements inbound." Kane swore. "How many?" The display lit up with movement. Voss's grip tightened. "All of them." The first warship arrived within minutes, but this time the Xiphos didn't ignore them. This time, they saw the Iron Soul. And this time, they were coming to erase it. The Iron Soul rocked under the force of the first impact. Metal screamed against metal, the ship's reinforced hull absorbing the initial shock, but Voss felt it like a pulse in his bones. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an execution. "Shields holding at 36%, Harlan called out, his fingers moving frantically over the heads-up display. "They'll breach us in under 2 minutes, Vex muttered, her voice like ground glass. "We need to move." The laser plasma display flickered, filled with the haunting red marks of Xiphos warships closing in from every direction. Their movements were methodical, hunting patterns as precise as a blade against a throat. "They don't fire unless they know the shot will kill," Tarn said, his tone eerily steady. "They're watching how we react. Then let's give them something to react to." Voss pushed off the command railing, turning toward Kane. "Navigation. How fast can we pull a full thrust burst?" Kane's expression was grim. "Fast enough to tear the ship in half if we're not careful." "Do it anyway." For a moment Kane hesitated, then nodded. "Strap in." The ship lurched forward, its thrusters roaring as the Iron Soul cut an unnatural angle through the battlefield. The Xiphos adjusted instantly, adapting to the maneuver, until the ship veered sharply again, the artificial gravity straining against their bodies. Voss's breath was sharp. "Vex, I need a read on the largest enemy vessel." She was already scanning. 90 kilometers out. No identifiable weak points." Tarn's mechanical fingers flexed over the weapon's interface. "That's because they don't have any." Then we make one. He tapped into the targeting systems, isolating an area on the Xiphos warship's core structure where the hull subtly shifted and readjusted. It wasn't armor plating. It was something else. It's evolving, Vex murmured. A realization settled in the space between them. The Xiphos weren't built. They were grown. Kane's jaw clenched. We're not fighting machines. We're fighting something that learns in real time. Voss inhaled, steadying his thoughts. Then we stop playing by their rules. He turned toward Tarn. How much power can we push into a direct impact rail shot? Tarn was already moving, adjusting calculations, rerouting auxiliary energy. If I overcharge the capacitors and reroute from secondary systems, I can give you a shot strong enough to shake them. Then make it happen. The ship buckled under another impact, warning lights flashing red across the bridge. The smell of burning insulation filled the air, the ship groaning under the strain of its own existence. "They're boxing us in," Harlan called out. "We're almost there," Tarn muttered, his hands moving like a surgeon preparing for the final incision. Vex's display pulsed. "Target lock acquired," Voss exhaled. "Fire." The railgun roared like a dying star, sending a single kinetic warhead barreling through the void, not toward the center of the Xiphos vessel, but toward the outer ridges where its form was still shifting. For the first time, the enemy hesitated. The shot hit. The Xiphos ship convulsed, its hull fracturing outward in a way that defied engineering. It wasn't damage, it was resistance, as if the organism itself had just experienced something it had never encountered before. And then it began to repair itself. Vex's hands curled into fists. "They're adapting." Voss was already moving. "Then we hit them again before they finished learning." But before Tarn could realign the weapons, the entire battlefield shifted. The Xiphos fleet changed formation, not to attack, to retreat. Harlan's voice was hoarse. "They're leaving?" Number not leaving, regrouping. Voss stared at the retreating shapes, his mind racing. The Xiphos had been winning. Their victory was inevitable. There was no tactical reason to fall back unless— "They weren't here for us," Vex whispered. The realization struck with the weight of a falling star. This battle had never been about the Iron Soul. The Xiphos had come to the ruins because of what the crew had triggered, and now they had what they needed. Voss turned to the heads-up display. "Find out where they're going." Vex's hands moved fast, tracing the trajectory. "They're moving toward the nearest Alliance-controlled system. Not a war front, not a military outpost, a civilian colony." Kane's expression darkened. "They're about to wipe out an entire planet." Voss's grip tightened around the rail. "Not if we stop them first." For the first time, the Xiphos had reacted to something unpredictable. They had hesitated. That meant they weren't invincible. They could be outmaneuvered. Tarn's voice was sharp. "Commander, the ship won't last another battle without major modifications." Voss exhaled, the weight of the fight settling into his chest. "Then we rebuild it." The crew exchanged glances, the magnitude of the decision settling into their bones. The Iron Soul had survived when it shouldn't have. But survival wasn't enough anymore. They had to become something stronger, something the Xiphos had never faced before. Voss straightened, his voice firm. "We turn the ship into the deadliest thing in the galaxy." No one argued. The Iron Soul felt heavier, not from damage, though its hull bore the scars of every battle it had limped away from, but from the weight of what was coming. Voss stood at the bridge, watching the laser plasma display cycle through scans. The Xiphos fleet had moved toward the Alliance-controlled system, its purpose clear: eradication, assimilation, extinction. "They're not going to just burn that colony," Vex said, her voice clipped. "They're going to rewrite it, just like the others." Kane exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "So, what's the plan, Commander?" "Because unless we're dropping a black hole on them, we don't have enough firepower to stop that many ships." Voss didn't look away from the display. "We don't need firepower. We need to break their pattern." Tarn frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're biological machines," Voss said. "They don't fight wars. They consume them. Adapt to them." His grip tightened against the railing. "So we give them a problem they can't solve." A silence settled over the bridge, thick with the scent of heated metal and the faint sting of burned wiring, the aftermath of overworked systems. Vex's fingers tapped a slow rhythm against her console. "You want to make the Iron Soul unpredictable?" Voss nodded. Tarn let out a slow breath. "That's going to take more than patchwork upgrades." "Then we stop patching," Voss said, turning to face them. "We rebuild." Kane snorted. "While running from a fleet?" Vex shot him a look. "Do you have a better idea?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Voss turned back to the heads-up display. "We have one advantage left. They still don't see us as a primary threat. We use that time to turn this ship into something they'll never be able to predict." His voice hardened. "Something they won't be able to stop." The overhaul began immediately. The Iron Soul's hull plating was stripped and reforged, entire sections of outdated technology discarded. Tarn led the engineering teams, sweat streaking his face, his cybernetic fingers leaving faint imprints on the overheated steel. Vex rewired the ship's artificial intelligence, programming it to counteract Xiphos scanning patterns. The Iron Soul would no longer be a fixed entity. It would shift, react, change its own energy signature mid-battle, a ship that existed between logic and chaos. Kane worked with the weapons systems, modifying the railguns into something more violent. Each shot now carried an unstable gravitational core, making it impossible to predict the trajectory. And at the center of it all was Voss, overseeing every adjustment, every calculation. He barely slept. None of them did. Time was a dying thing, slipping through their hands like sand through fractured glass. They had hours left before the Xiphos reached the colony. And then the warning alarm blared. "Enemy movement detected," Nova announced, her voice smooth but edged with urgency. Voss snapped his head toward the laser plasma display. A ship had broken away from the Xiphos fleet. Not just any ship. The Star Eater. Kane's fingers curled into fists. "They sent their apex predator to hunt us." Vex inhaled sharply. "That thing consumed an entire sector, and now it's locked onto us." Tarn wiped the sweat from his brow. "Then we test the upgrades." Voss's expression was unreadable. He wasn't thinking about the fight. He was thinking about what it meant. The Xiphos had ignored them before. Now they were actively removing them from the battlefield, which meant the Iron Soul had become a variable they didn't like, and that meant they were finally doing something right. The Star Eater moved without acceleration. One moment it was in the distance. The next it was looming over them, a black mass of shifting plates and fluid metal. Its presence was overwhelming, like standing beneath an open sky just before a superstorm, the weight of gravity itself bending around it. "Weapons locked," Kane said, jaw tight. "Railguns loaded." Tarn checked his readouts. "Shields holding at max output, but I don't think they're going to help much." Vex's voice was tight. "We need to keep our movement erratic. If we fall into a pattern, they'll adapt." Voss exhaled slowly, then spoke one word: "Engage." The Iron Soul became a ghost. Its new form flickered between energy signatures, shifting between frequencies, its weapons firing in unpredictable rhythms. The Star Eater hesitated. For the first time, the Xiphos didn't immediately counterattack. They were processing, and that was the moment Voss struck. "Now!" The railguns fired in rapid succession, the gravitational cores twisting space mid-flight. The first shots tore into the Star Eater's hull, disrupting its shifting form. It reacted too slowly. A second volley impacted its core. The Star Eater convulsed. Its structure buckled, folding in on itself, struggling to repair. "They're lagging," Vex breathed. "They can't adjust fast enough." Voss's grip tightened on the railing. "Keep pushing." The Iron Soul pressed forward, hammering into the enemy with a ferocity the Xiphos had never encountered. For the first time, the Star Eater was losing. And then everything stopped. Not the battle, not the ship's movements. Reality itself. A pulse of darkness spread from the Star Eater's core, swallowing the light, bending gravity backward. The sensors flatlined. The displays shattered into static. Then the Iron Soul began to collapse inward. Not from weapons fire. From something deeper. Tarn cursed. "They're rewriting physics again," Kane shouted over the alarms. "We're losing structural integrity." Vex's hands flew over the console. "They're adapting again. We need to pull back." Voss's eyes were locked onto the black mass in front of them, his breath sharp. They were still missing something. The Iron Soul had forced the Xiphos to react, to retreat. But they hadn't won. Not yet. Then the displays flared back to life. Kane's eyes widened. "Commander?" Voss turned. The Xiphos fleet was returning, not in scattered numbers, not in waves. All of them. Vex's voice was barely above a whisper. "They know they can't adapt fast enough," Tarn swallowed. "So they're going to crush us with everything they have." Voss's fingers flexed against the metal railing. There was only one way forward now. His voice was cold. "Then we finish the rebuild." And when they were done, they would make the Xiphos regret ever underestimating them. The Iron Soul drifted in the aftermath of the battle, its hull scarred, its systems bleeding warnings into every console. The bridge reeked of scorched wiring and burned coolant, a tangible reminder of how close they had come to breaking apart. Yet they were still here, and so was the enemy. Voss stood at the center of the command deck, his gaze locked onto the laser plasma display, where the Xiphos fleet loomed like an impending storm, closing in with mathematical inevitability. "They're done playing with us," Kane said, the words edged with a cold finality. "Next engagement will be the last." Vex leaned against the console, exhaustion threading through her posture, but her mind was still calculating, still hunting for an opening. "They're not just coming to kill us. They're coming to erase us. Every system scan, every tactical readout suggests they're about to execute a total battlefield purge." "Which means we can't run," Tarn muttered, rubbing his cybernetic fingers together in thought. "Not anymore." Harlan's voice was tight. "Then what do we do?" Voss exhaled slowly, a breath measured like a countdown. Then he turned. "We finish the rebuild." The words settled over the bridge like a loaded weapon, each syllable weighted with the unspoken truth. This was their last chance. Kane gave a sharp nod. "What's the plan?" Voss stepped forward, his hands bracing against the railing, as the laser plasma display shifted to a schematic of the Iron Soul. Every part of it, damaged, outdated, repurposed, had gotten them this far. But it wasn't enough. Now, it had to be more. Vex pulled up energy dispersion models, her fingers flying across the interface. "We modify the reactor output to generate phased energy shifts, essentially scrambling our signature every few seconds." Kane frowned. "We've already done that." "Not like this." Vex's voice was sharp. "Right now we're using static disruption, randomized sequences. But that's predictable. We need to move dynamically, create oscillations that adapt faster than they can track. Instead of masking our presence, we turn the Iron Soul into a flickering anomaly, something that exists in between their scanning parameters." Tarn folded his arms. "So, a ghost." Voss nodded. "Exactly." Harlan shifted uneasily. "You realize that means we won't be able to track ourselves either." "Then we learn," Voss said. "Every crew member will have to operate on instinct. AI predictions won't work in this state. We're going manual." For a long second, no one spoke. Then Kane let out a breath. "Manual navigation in an active war zone. You really are trying to kill us." "No," Voss said, his gaze locked onto the display. "I'm making sure we don't die." Tarn took over, his mechanical fingers tapping against the console as he pulled up a schematic of their modified railguns. "We reinforce the projectile casings and introduce reactive gravity warheads." Vex's brows lifted. "That sounds unstable." "It is." Tarn's expression was grim. "But that's the point. The Xiphos have adapted to our current arsenal. They anticipate the timing, the impact force, the damage spread. If we want to punch through, we need weapons that don't behave the same way twice." Kane let out a sharp laugh, void of humor. "So what? You're making the rounds self-modifying?" Tarn's lips quirked upward. "More like self-destructive. Each projectile carries a disruptive charge that will react differently based on the surrounding gravitational pull. Some will detonate early, some will fragment, some will create micro-singularities before impact." "Unpredictable damage," Voss murmured. Tarn nodded. "Which means they won't be able to adapt in real time." Vex exhaled. "And if we miscalculate?" Tarn shrugged. Then we die. Silence settled over them. Then Voss straightened. Load them into the firing systems. Voss pulled up a new projection, a simulated battlefield overlay showing the Iron Soul against the Xiphos formation. We know they're bringing the entire fleet, but they have a centerpiece, the Star Eater. It's their nexus, their command node. Every battle adjustment, every tactical shift is relayed from that ship. Kane frowned. We already hit it once. It nearly tore us in half just trying to recover. We hit it the wrong way, Voss corrected. He expanded the display, focusing on the points where the Star Eater had shown delay in its reaction. Their fleet moves as a single entity, but the Star Eater acts as a relay hub. It processes incoming data, filters the variables, then distributes adaptation sequences. Vex's eyes widened. And if we cut off the relay, they stop adapting, Voss said. Tarn's fingers flexed. You're saying we don't need to destroy the entire fleet. Voss's voice was steel. We just need to make them blind. A ripple of understanding passed through the crew. Kane cracked his knuckles. Okay, let's say we pull this off. We disrupt their relay, throw them into chaos. How do we kill the Star Eater? Voss turned to Tarn. How much reactor energy would we need to overload a singularity weapon? Tarn blinked. Then his mouth curved into something sharp and dangerous. Oh, you want to make a bomb. Voss's voice was even. Number I want to make an extinction event. The crew worked with a feverish intensity, stripping the ship down to its essential components, rerouting power, loading the newly modified railgun rounds. The reactor was pushed to near-collapse levels, cycling energy in a way that would keep them hidden until the last possible second. And at the center of it all, a single unfired warhead sat in the launch bay, its payload humming with contained devastation. Cain stared at it. You do realize if this thing detonates at the wrong moment, we go with it. Voss looked at him. We were never supposed to survive this. Cain let out a low breath, then shook his head with a grin. Then let's make sure we don't go out quietly. The alarms triggered. The Xiphos fleet had arrived. Vex swallowed. They're scanning for us. They won't find us, Voss said. Not until we want them to. Tarn stepped back from the weapons console, his fingers hovering over the ignition sequence. Say the word, Commander. Voss exhaled. Then at last, he smiled. Let's end this. The Iron Soul lay in wait, buried beneath the wreckage of lesser ships, its signature flickering like a dying ember in the void. The Xiphos fleet filled the horizon, a sea of moving, shifting constructs, folding and unfolding in their grotesque mechanical grace. They had come for total annihilation, a purge of all that remained human in this sector. Voss stood at the center of the bridge, the red emergency lights casting his features in sharp relief. His fingers curled around the command rail, knuckles stiff, jaw locked, mind razor sharp. He wasn't watching the fleet. He was watching the Star Eater, the beating heart of the enemy. Nova's voice crackled across the bridge. Enemy vessels maintaining adaptive formation. Central relay remains active. They still think they have control, Vex murmured, her gaze never leaving the heads-up display, where the modified payload sat primed in the launch bay. They don't know they've already lost. Kane exhaled, his fingers tapping against his console. They'll know soon enough. Tarn leaned back from the weapons panel, his cybernetic hands flexing, coated in the sweat and grime of last-minute modifications. This ship shouldn't even be flying, let alone doing what we're about to do. Voss's eyes gleamed. Then let's make sure the galaxy remembers exactly what this ship is capable of. The Xiphos fleet inched forward, their eerie, synchronized movement sending a ripple of unease through even the most hardened crew members. These weren't warships in the traditional sense. They were predators, reducing entire fleets to nothing, rewriting the battlefield until no history remained but their own. Not this time. Voss lifted his chin. Nova, execute Ghost Protocol. The bridge dimmed in an instant, power rerouting through the modified core. The ship flickered, not invisible, not cloaked, but unreadable, an anomaly between scans, skipping between states of existence. The Xiphos hesitated. For the first time, they were forced to calculate. Voss turned to Tarn. Fire control to manual. Tarn's fingers danced across the controls, locking them out of the AI's predictive algorithms. Confirmed, all firing solutions manual override. Kane let out a sharp breath. We're flying blind. Voss shook his head. Number, we're flying human. The Iron Soul surged forward. Not a straight assault, not an expected maneuver. Instead, it rolled, twisted, collapsed inward, then expanded again, a ship that should not be moving the way it was moving. Its engines flared at irregular intervals, its weapons fired in staggered bursts. The Xiphos couldn't adapt. They lagged. It was a fraction of a second, an imperceptible delay to anything but the human mind. But Voss saw it. So did Kane. So did every battle-hardened veteran on board. There's our opening, Kane growled. Take it. Tarn primed the payload, his pulse drumming in his ears. Warhead armed. Vex rerouted all auxiliary power, pulling everything into the Singularity bomb's charge cycle. Weapons online. Target locked. The Star Eater loomed ahead, its massive body unfolding, shifting, trying to compensate. It was already too late. Voss exhaled. Launch! The Iron Soul screamed toward the heart of the Xiphos fleet, its railguns unloading an unpredictable spread of gravitational shells, magnetic pulses, and unstable warheads. The enemy ships folded inward, their own adaptation algorithms working against them, their bodies bending to compensate. But that was the trick, wasn't it? They compensated, they adjusted, they learned, and for the first time, that was their downfall. Because the moment they restructured to absorb the damage, the Singularity warhead detonated. A single unstable black hole ripped open within the Star Eater's core. The Xiphos had designed their ships to survive any external force, any impact, any weapon directed at them. But they had never faced a weapon that turned their own biology against them. The Star Eater buckled. Its shifting body, so perfect in its adaptability, suddenly found itself trapped within its own evolution. The feedback loop was instantaneous and catastrophic. As the Singularity collapsed, it took the core with it, sending rippling energy waves outward in an expanding ring of destruction. The Xiphos fleet hesitated. Then it broke apart. Their unity shattered, their synchronization lost. And in the chaos, humanity struck. The Iron Soul wove through the wreckage, guns blazing, hammering the remaining enemy ships before they could reform. Each railgun shot found its mark, each gravitational pulse pulled them into the Singularity's dying wake. Kane's laughter rang over the comms. Look at them! They don't know what the hell just happened. Tarn let out a breath. They're failing. Vex swallowed, watching the fleet fracture before her eyes. No, she whispered. They're dying. Voss watched the battlefield unfold, the Xiphos losing something deeper than just ships. They were losing cohesion. Their entire warform had relied on absolute dominance. The moment that dominance was shaken, they had no fallback, no survival instinct, no redundancy. They had underestimated humans. They had never faced ingenuity before. And now, they never would again. The last of the Xiphos ships imploded, their bodies unable to maintain cohesion. Their own biology had betrayed them. Their own perfection had become their undoing. Silence settled across the bridge. Then Nova spoke. No remaining hostiles detected. The war was over. A slow exhale. A collective weight lifted off their bones. Voss turned to his crew, letting the moment settle. Kane ran a hand through his hair, his breath shaky. Holy shit. Tarn leaned back, exhausted but grinning. The most useless ship in the fleet just wiped out an entire extinction-level species. Vex let out a sharp laugh. No one's ever going to believe this. Voss stepped forward, eyes fixed on the heads-up display. The wreckage of the Xiphos fleet stretched before them, but the Iron Soul remained. Not pristine, not untouched, but victorious. His voice was quiet, steady. They don't have to believe it, he said. They just have to remember. Because the Iron Soul had started as a relic, dismissed, forgotten, laughed at. And now? Now it was the ship that ended the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. Now it was the ship that rewrote history. Now it was the ship that turned the tide of an unwinnable war. And now the galaxy would never forget what humanity could do, what humanity had always done: adapt, outthink, survive. The most useless ship in the fleet? Number It had become the deadliest. The Iron Soul drifted forward, leaving the ruins of its enemy behind. And humanity marked the stars forever.